What if your reflection wasn't just a reflection, but a doorway no one ever told you about? A mirror so ancient, so forbidden, that even the priests of Egypt hid it from the world, not to protect you, but to protect themselves. You were never told that your consciousness can be unlocked through light and silence, that the eyes staring back at you know everything you've forgotten. This isn't imagination, it's a technique erased from books, rituals, and history itself. And 99% of people will live their whole lives without ever daring to look deep enough. But something brought you here. This is a call to face what you've buried and become who you were meant to be. The mirror of Thoth waits, but it only opens for those who ask the right question. But only if you're ready. What if the image you've been calling you is just a costume your soul wears to play along with the world? Imagine standing alone in a dimly lit room, a silent mirror in front of you, and realizing after a few minutes that your face doesn't look like yours anymore. It shifts, it breathes, it blinks at the wrong time. And in that moment, you feel something ancient stirring beneath the surface of your consciousness. In the temples of ancient Chem, long before Egypt became Egypt, the priesthood of Thoth used a mirror, not for vanity, but as a gate. A polished black surface, resting in silence, used in rituals that were whispered about, never written down. Initiates would stare into it for hours, sometimes days, until the boundary between self and symbol collapsed. They believed the soul would show itself, not as a metaphor, but as a living presence beyond the skin. Centuries later, science brushed up against this same ritual without realizing it. Dr. Giovanni Caputo, from the University of Urbino, led a study where volunteers stared at themselves in a mirror under low light. Within 10 minutes, over 60% saw distortions, other faces, or even monstrous figures. The brain, left without sensory anchors, begins pulling from the subconscious, memories, fears, archetypes, until the reflection becomes a projection. But there's something more unnerving than illusions, because some people don't see anything frightening. They see something familiar, something they don't remember becoming, but that's been watching them all along. In one video from the Brazilian channel Estudos de Consciência, a man recounts his 21-day mirror ritual. He speaks softly, almost trembling, describing the moment his reflection smiled when he wasn't smiling. Not a distortion, not a hallucination, something else. And then, as if remembering a buried truth, he simply says, "It wasn't me, but it knew everything about me." We were taught that mirrors reflect light, but ancient initiates believed they reflect memory. Not memory of events, but of essence. And it's precisely when your ego begins to dissolve that something else begins to take shape in the silence. Because the real question isn't what you see when you stare long enough. It's who has been waiting on the other side of that mirror all along. And it's exactly when the eyes stop blinking in sync that you realize the mirror was never showing your face in the first place. There's a quiet kind of magic in standing before your own reflection. No noise, no movement, just you, and the eyes you've avoided meeting for far too long. At first, it feels strange, then uncomfortable, and eventually something shifts. Not in the mirror, but in you. The silence becomes heavy, time softens, and the person staring back isn't just an image anymore, it's a question. The mind, as modern neuroscience reveals, is deeply programmable, but not through logic or repetition alone. Dr. Caroline Leaf, a cognitive neuroscientist, demonstrated that the brain's structure physically changes when we introduce emotionally charged affirmations. Now imagine combining those affirmations with direct eye contact in the mirror. You're not just saying, "I am enough." You're saying it while looking into the eyes of someone who's been through everything you've survived. And suddenly it hits harder. It hits home. Louise Hay, one of the most influential voices in emotional healing, taught a deceptively simple practice: mirror work. People facing cancer, grief, abuse, stood in front of their reflections and said out loud what they never had the courage to tell themselves. "I forgive you. I love you. I'm listening now." And somehow something inside responded, not because the mirror has power, but because the mirror removes escape. There's nowhere to look but inward. Carl Jung warned us, until the unconscious becomes conscious, It will control your life, and you'll call it fate. The mirror interrupts that autopilot. It places you face to face with your patterns, your defenses, your voice. That flicker of discomfort when you speak to yourself, that's the surface breaking. The subconscious doesn't like to be exposed. It prefers the shadows. But the mirror, calm, unmoving, pulls it out word by word, breath by breath. There's an experiment anyone can try. Stand still. Look into your eyes. Say your full name. Wait. Then ask out loud, what am I still hiding from myself? The silence that follows is where the work begins. Some people burst into tears without knowing why. Others laugh. And a few report feeling like a memory just passed behind their own eyes. Because the mirror isn't speaking, but your inner voice finally is. It's the subtle opening. This thin veil lifting between what you say you are and what you feel you are, that becomes dangerous to your old identity. And once that crack appears, you can't unsee it. Something starts to wake up. A version of you that remembers everything. Your hopes, your wounds, your truth. And it doesn't want to go back to sleep. What's terrifying isn't what the mirror shows. It's what it remembers. It remembers the parts of you that begged to be heard and never were. The younger self you silenced. The voice that trembled during your first heartbreak. The dreams you buried under real life. And as each layer peels away, the mirror doesn't flinch. It waits, because it knows you're almost ready. But the subconscious doesn't give up easily. It will fight. It will distract. It will beg you to look away. So the question becomes, can you keep looking, even when it gets uncomfortable? Can you hold the gaze, even when the truth isn't beautiful? Because what lives behind your eyes might just rewrite everything you thought you were. And it's in that fragile moment between recognition and surrender that the real shift begins. There's a moment just after your eyes adjust to the dimness when the mirror begins to change. It's not sudden. It's subtle, like a shadow moving behind glass. At first, you think it's a trick of the light, a misfiring of the mind. But then it blinks. It smirks. It moves when you don't. And in that instant, the reflection becomes something else entirely. Something watching. This isn't fiction. On the Reddit forum r/astral projection, dozens of users have shared eerily similar experiences. Ordinary people practicing mirror gazing in low light, suddenly seeing faces that weren't theirs. A woman described seeing an elderly man stare back at her. Another reported her reflection aging before her eyes until it became skeletal. But what unsettled them most wasn't the appearance, it was the feeling. Like the presence in the mirror wasn't of them, but through them. Science does offer a glimpse into this phenomenon. The Italian psychologist Giovanni Caputo coined the term strange face illusion, a documented effect where prolonged self-gazing triggers dissociation. Participants report seeing demons, animals, or unfamiliar people in the mirror. Caputo concluded that it's the brain's attempt to fill in visual gaps, blending imagination with perception. But what if the mind isn't creating these images, but receiving them? In Zen monasteries in France, mirror gazing is used during silent retreats. Monks sit with a single candle lit behind them, facing their reflection in complete stillness. Thich Nhat Bao, a Vietnamese French monk, once said in a filmed retreat, "The face you see after 1 hour is not the one your parents gave you. It's the one your karma formed." Some leave the exercise laughing. Others leave in tears. A few refuse to speak at all. Not because of fear, but reverence. There's a pattern that keeps repeating. The longer someone holds the gaze, the more the mirror begins to respond. Some report expressions changing without any movement. One man described watching his reflection raise an eyebrow, and he swore he didn't. Another woman, in a YouTube interview on the channel Beyond Awakening, confessed she stopped the practice after seeing a second face overlaid on her own. When asked to describe it, she only said it knew I was lying. What if, beneath the surface of your reflection, there are layers of consciousness waiting to emerge? Not personalities, not past lives, but frequencies, stored emotions, fragmented identities, echoes of things absorbed but never understood. And when your awareness sinks low enough, long enough, those frequencies take shape. They peer back, and what they reveal might not be what you're ready to face. That's the paradox. The mirror doesn't lie. but it also doesn't explain. It shows. And sometimes it shows you what you've spent your entire life pretending not to see. The part of you that manipulates, the part that fears, the part that still cries in silence. And when that part grows bold enough to where your face, the boundary begins to slip. Because at that point, the mirror is no longer a surface. It's a membrane, thin, flexible, and just porous enough for something else to reach through. Imagine looking into the mirror and realizing that the person staring back is making different choices. Not in real time, but in a parallel thread of reality you can't quite reach. You feel it as a pull in the chest, a microsecond of misalignment. Like the version of you in the mirror is slightly off, but not wrong. Just chosen differently. And suddenly a strange thought arises. What if you're not looking at a copy, but at a fork? In the world of quantum physics, Hugh Everett's many worlds interpretation suggests that every decision spawns a new universe. One where you stayed, one where you left, one where you spoke the truth, and another where you stayed silent. Most people dismiss it as theory, but for some mystics and spiritual scientists, this isn't speculation. It's practice. The mirror becomes a portal, not metaphorically, but energetically, a soft veil between timelines where the self fractures into possibility. Vadim Zeland, author of Reality Transurfing, teaches that we each have a quantum double, a future self vibrating in alignment with our intentions. According to him, this double can be accessed through conscious visualization and specific mirror rituals. He describes standing before your reflection and asking your double for guidance, not in words, but in frequency. Not to change the reflection, but to synchronize with the version of you that already succeeded. In one English language video from the channel Athena Jezik, a woman shares her experience after trying Zealand's method. She stood before her mirror for several minutes in silence, focusing only on breath. Slowly, her reflection began to blur, not from her eyes, but from something deeper. She says, "It wasn't that the image changed. It was that I became her, the me that had already healed, already forgiven, already moved on." And what happened next in her real life? A phone call she'd been dreading for years finally came. Here's the unsettling part. If your future self already exists, and if the mirror can access that alignment, then what's keeping you from becoming them right now? The only barrier might be belief, and the programming of a mind trained to think time only moves forward. But some traditions have always known better. In certain Tibetan texts, mirrors are used not to see the present, but to reflect what is most in balance in your field. They don't predict, they reveal. You might not feel it at first, but with time, the mirror begins to tug at your awareness. Not backward, not forward, sideways, as if another you is pacing just beyond the glass, waiting, breathing, whispering questions you haven't dared to ask. And the moment you lock eyes, not with the reflection, but with the possibility, you'll feel it. Because maybe the mirror doesn't copy you. Maybe it remembers a version of you that never forgot who you really are. And when that version finally begins to surface, reality starts to bend. But only if you keep looking. There's something disarming about looking straight into your own eyes. Not a passing glance. Not while brushing your teeth or fixing your hair. But truly looking. As if you're trying to catch yourself in a lie. At first, it feels absurd, like a child pretending to be someone else. But wait long enough, and something ancient stirs behind the gaze. A ripple, a flicker, then a wave of emotion you can't name, rising from somewhere memory can't reach. In 2004, researchers at the University of Cambridge began investigating how emotional memory could be reactivated and even rewritten under certain conditions. This process, called memory reconsolidation, showed that the brain doesn't just recall the past, it reshapes it depending on how and when that memory is accessed. So what happens when you stare into your own eyes and ask a question you've never had the courage to voice? The mind doesn't just remember, it reopens. Therapists who specialize in regression techniques have begun using the mirror as a tool to access preverbal trauma. Memories without images, without words, but stored in the body and reflected in the face. One practitioner, featured on the Brazilian channel Consciência Sistêmica, guided a woman through a mirror ritual where she simply repeated her name while looking at herself. On the third day, she collapsed into tears, reporting a vivid dream that night of being abandoned as a toddler, something her conscious mind had never recalled. Dr. Joe Dispenza offers a physiological perspective on why this happens. According to his research, the heart's electromagnetic field synchronizes with the brain during deep states of self-awareness. When you maintain eye contact with yourself and direct emotion into that connection, you begin to create a feedback loop. You're not just thinking, you're broadcasting. And the subconscious, which speaks in images and sensations, finally feels safe enough to respond. It doesn't always come in flashes or visions. Sometimes the memory shows up as a heaviness in the chest, a whisper of guilt, a strange warmth in the gut. It might take the shape of a smell from childhood, or the sudden return of a song you hadn't heard in years. The mirror doesn't give you answers. It triggers the internal mechanisms you forgot how to activate. And what emerges doesn't ask for your permission. But what if the memory that rises isn't just a personal one? What if it's ancestral, genetic, stored not only in your mind, but in the field that surrounds your body? Because when your eyes begin to blur and the reflection breathes without you, you start to realize the memory doesn't come from within. It comes through. And that's when things become unpredictable. Not because the mirror lied, but because you finally stopped lying to yourself. And in that crack of truth, memory returns, not as a story, but as a force. There's a fragile moment deep into a mirror ritual when something shifts, not in your face, not in your breath, but in your sense of direction. You're still looking at your reflection, but suddenly it feels like it's no longer passive, as if the gaze isn't just going outward. It's circling back, like a loop folding in on itself. And just for a second, you can't tell if you're looking at the mirror or if it's looking at you. Carl Jung described this as the confrontation with the unconscious, not the vague fog of emotions we suppress, but a living, intelligent force that reacts when observed. He warned that the unconscious has autonomy, that once awakened, it stops being content in the shadows. He wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." But he also knew waking up has consequences. There are real accounts of this reversal. On the French forum Drissimo.fr, a woman practicing mirror meditation wrote that after a few weeks, her reflection began blinking out of sync. At first, she thought it was fatigue, but then it started reacting before she did, tilting its head, shifting its eyes moments before she moved. She stopped the practice after a dream where her mirror image walked out of the frame. She never tried it again. Neuroscientist Donald Hoffman proposes something that sounds esoteric, but isn't. He argues that what we call reality is just a user interface, a simplified version of what's really happening. That our senses don't show us truth, they show us survival. So when you stare long enough into a mirror, bypassing the usual filters, are you still seeing what's real? Or are you catching glimpses of the actual system behind the illusion? There's a term in certain esoteric circles for this moment, the inversion. It marks the point where your conscious mind is no longer driving the process. You've entered a feedback loop where awareness collapses in on itself, like two mirrors facing each other. You're not seeing yourself anymore. You're seeing the awareness that usually stays behind your thoughts. And once you see it, it sees you. That's when people report the chills, the sudden tears, the unexplainable sense that someone or something just made eye contact with them through their own face. Not malevolent, not kind, just ancient, present, watching. And it's precisely at that point that reality begins to unravel. Not in grand, cinematic chaos, but in subtle fractures. The kind you feel when the world seems too quiet, too synchronized, as if everything around you is waiting for you to notice. But notice what exactly? That's where the mirror always stays silent. There's a ritual so simple, so quiet, that most people overlook its power. No incense, no chanting, just you, a mirror, and the courage to stand still. At first, it feels like nothing is happening. But if you follow the steps precisely, something strange begins to unfold. Not in the glass, but in your nervous system. It's like a code being dialed from deep within, waiting for the last digit to unlock what's been buried all along. This method isn't modern. It echoes instructions found in Hermetic texts, particularly fragments attributed to the lineage of Thoth. They describe a practice called Jedhakau, or standing word, in which the initiate speaks to their reflection using specific vocal frequencies and pauses. In modern terms, this has been adapted into a technique where you simply stand before a mirror, look into your own eyes, and say your full name slowly, clearly, with intent. Then you wait. Psychologically, this is where it begins to work. Saying your own name while holding eye contact with yourself activates regions in the brain associated with self-recognition and identity disruption. According to researchers in social neuroscience, this moment creates a kind of short circuit. Your brain tries to process you as both subject and object. And that dissonance, that's the gateway. It weakens the rigidity of the ego. It opens the floor for something deeper to speak. In a video by the YouTube channel Spiritual Lux, a woman recounts performing this protocol for 14 consecutive days. At first, it felt awkward, pointless even. But on day 9, something shifted. She said her name and suddenly felt overcome by a rush of emotion that had no obvious source. Grief, love, and something she described as a recognition. Not of her reflection, but of the version of herself she had stopped listening to. The one who had been silenced for years. What this method does, at its core, is create intimacy with yourself in a way most people never experience. And it's through this intimacy that old programming begins to break down. Thoughts that once had power lose their grip. Emotional patterns start to feel foreign. And for the first time, the mirror doesn't reflect your face, it reflects your state. You begin to see where you've been stuck, and more importantly, where you've been free all along. But there's a moment in this ritual where things become unpredictable. For some, the reflection begins to change, not visually, but energetically. They feel it, a second presence, a shift in atmosphere, as if the version of themselves that always knew the truth has finally stepped forward. And what it shows you next, that's where the mirror stops reflecting and begins responding. Because this isn't about affirmations. It's not about believing in yourself. It's about decoding the architecture of the soul, line by line, memory by memory. And once that system reboots, you won't just think differently. You'll feel like someone else entirely. Someone who was always there, just waiting to be called by name. Not all rituals were meant to survive. Some were too raw, too direct, too powerful to be handed down without distortion. And so they were buried. Not by accident, but by design. Hidden beneath layers of doctrine, burned from scrolls, whispered away in dark corners of history. Yet fragments remain, enough to piece together something that still breathes, especially when the mirror is involved. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, a text excluded from the biblical canon, there's mention of silence as a path to gnosis, divine knowing. Gnostic sects would retreat into dark chambers with a single reflective surface, not to admire themselves, but to erase themselves. They believed that only when the self dissolved could the true voice of the divine be heard. These rituals were banned as heretical, considered too dangerous because they bypassed priesthood, tradition, and control. Further east, in the Naqshbandi Sufi order, a lesser-known branch practiced deep muraqabah, a form of inner vision, using bowls of water as reflective portals. These were not for fortune-telling, but for self-erasure. One practitioner, in an old manuscript preserved in the Bokhara archives, described seeing the face behind all faces during one of these rituals. A gaze that wasn't his, yet knew everything he had ever done. The mirror in these practices was never external. It was a trapdoor into the infinite. Fast forward to today, and these rituals are resurfacing, not in temples, but in online whispers. On the Spanish YouTube channel Sabiduria Ancestral, a man shared how he recreated the mirror technique from an Egyptian funerary rite using a polished obsidian disc. After 2 weeks of practice, he began experiencing disorientation in time. He claimed he could no longer tell whether his dreams were from this life or another one. It wasn't fear that made him stop. It was something else. The overwhelming sensation that time had folded inward. Why were these rituals erased? because they offered direct access. They didn't require intermediaries, confessions, or institutions. The mirror, in its silence, held space for a truth too disruptive to be systematized, that the divine is not above or beyond, but within. And that once you meet it, there's no going back to the old version of self that sought permission to exist. But here's the part no one talks about. These rituals don't just show you light. They show you what must die. The masks, the stories, the inherited shame. And it is in that moment, when your reflection no longer answers to your name, that something begins to fracture beautifully and irreversibly. Because once you've used the mirror not to find yourself, but to lose yourself, you don't just awaken, you return. And what greets you on the other side isn't a reflection. It's a remembering. There's a point in the mirror ritual where things stop feeling mystical and start feeling unstable. You begin with clarity, searching, listening, open. But as the minutes stretch on and the silence grows heavier, the boundary between self and space becomes soft. Your reflection starts breathing a little too slowly. The shadows on your face don't quite follow the rules of light. And you wonder, not in fear, but in eerie recognition, am I still the one looking? This tension between awakening and collapse isn't new. In 2006, Dr. Peter Brugger from the University of Zurich documented cases of what he called mirror psychosis, a rare phenomenon where individuals become convinced that their reflection is autonomous, even malevolent. It was mostly observed in patients with temporal lobe epilepsy or extreme dissociation. But what if those experiences weren't purely pathological? What if they were glimpses of consciousness expanding too quickly? Transpersonal psychology acknowledges this delicate threshold. Stanislav Grof, a pioneer in consciousness studies, warned of spiritual emergencies, experiences that look like breakdowns on the surface but are actually profound shifts in identity. The mirror, when used without grounding, can act as a fast track to that edge. Because it doesn't lie. It shows you what you've denied, suppressed, or never integrated. And if your foundation isn't ready, the truth doesn't just hurt, it dismantles. One user on Reddit's r/occult shared a chilling account. After weeks of mirror gazing in low light, he began to see his face slowly decay each night. Not grotesquely, but with a realism that made him question his sanity. Eyes darkening, skin sagging, teeth vanishing. At first, he resisted, but the dreams that followed were worse. He was being watched by himself. Eventually, he stopped, but he admitted, I was never the same after that. I feel like I met something that wasn't just in the mirror. And then comes the paradox. What we call madness, some traditions call initiation. The cracking of identity. The disintegration of the false self. Dr. Gabor Mate says, trauma isn't what happens to you. It's what happens inside you. So when the mirror begins to stir something unbearable, maybe it isn't breaking you. Maybe it's finally showing you what was broken long before you ever stood in front of it. Because there's a moment in this ritual where the mirror no longer reflects, it absorbs. You feel it drawing something out. Guilt, shame, maybe even ancestral weight you never knew you were carrying. And then it starts giving something back. Not visions, not clarity, but questions. Impossible questions. Ones that make you doubt whether the life you've built is even yours. And it's in that split second when your reflection smiles without permission or shifts before you do, that the illusion of control begins to slip. Not just in the mirror, but in your grip on reality itself. And what emerges in its place is the part of you that was never constructed, only remembered. There are places in this world where time doesn't flow in straight lines. Still lakes at sunrise, the silence before a storm, or the flickering silence between you and your own reflection. In these moments, the mirror becomes more than a surface, it becomes a witness. And the question lingers, what if it's not just reflecting light, but storing something? Not data, not imagery, but memory. Not of your mind, but of your soul. Certain spiritual scientists, like Dr. Konstantin Karakov, known for his work in energy fields and Kirlian photography, believe objects can retain energetic imprints. According to this theory, every emotional moment leaves a subtle mark in space. Now imagine how many times your mirror has watched you cry, rehearse lies, or avoid your own gaze. Over time, what if that glass has become something more than neutral? What if it remembers? John Dee, the 16th century mystic who served under Queen Elizabeth I, claimed to use a black obsidian mirror to contact spirits. In his detailed journals, he described speaking with angelic beings who offered visions of cosmic order and warnings for humanity. Dee didn't believe he was seeing the future. He believed he was accessing memory, echoes from higher dimensions. The obsidian, polished like still water, wasn't showing reflections. It was showing impressions that lingered beyond time. In the Facebook group Past Life Regression Experiences, a Canadian woman posted a detailed account of her work with a black mirror. She used it daily in silence, always at dusk. Within 2 weeks, she began having vivid dreams of medieval herbs, rituals, and plague outbreaks. She described the images with historical accuracy, later confirmed through research. But what moved her most wasn't the knowledge, it was the feeling. It wasn't like seeing something new, she wrote. It was like remembering something I'd already lived. Modern memory theory backs up one strange idea. Memory is not stored in a single place. It's distributed, woven into the body, the emotions, even the environment. What if the soul works the same way? What if the mirror you stand before today isn't just reflecting your face, but reflecting other versions of you that stood there long before you were born? You may never notice it directly, but maybe you felt it. That eerie sensation that the mirror is aware, that its silence is heavy with more than emptiness, that your own face looks unfamiliar, not because you've changed, but because something older is surfacing behind your eyes. And in that moment, when the past starts to rise not in thoughts, but in presence, you'll understand that memory is not something you carry. It's something that carries you, especially when it decides it's time to be remembered. And that remembering always begins with the mirror. There's a mask you wear so often, you forget it isn't skin. It smiles when needed, nods at the right time, tells the world everything's fine. But beneath it, something waits, something quieter, older, less polished. When you stare into the mirror long enough, that mask begins to tremble. It doesn't fall all at once. It fractures, slowly, not because you see something new, but because you finally stop looking away from what's always been there. In his theory of the mirror stage, Jacques Lacan described the moment when a child first sees itself and forms an identity based on that image. It's not the real self, it's a symbol, a constructed fiction that follows us for the rest of our lives. That mirror version becomes the ideal, the ego. But what happens when you return to that same mirror years later, carrying everything you've lived, and you watch that version no longer match who you feel you are? A Brazilian therapist, known on Instagram as at Psycho Espelho, once shared the story of a woman who had never cried in front of anyone. She began mirror sessions as part of her trauma recovery. On the 4th day, she stood in front of her reflection, whispered her name, and collapsed in tears. Not because she remembered a specific event, but because for the first time in her life, she realized she didn't recognize the face she had been calling hers. In ancient Japanese Shinto tradition, the mirror is sacred. Called kagami, it's not just a tool. It's a symbol of divine self-awareness. The term kamioroshi refers to the descent of spirit into consciousness, often experienced after prolonged contemplation before a mirror. Practitioners believe the divine doesn't speak to the mind, it speaks through reflection. And before the divine arrives, the false self must fall silent. The mirror doesn't demand anything. It simply waits until the lies get tired. This unraveling isn't dramatic. It doesn't shout. It whispers truths you've tried to outrun. You'll begin to notice it in the way your posture shifts, in how your eyes soften or harden. You'll say your name, and it won't sound quite right, because that name belonged to someone else, a version of you that made sense once but doesn't fit anymore. The reflection doesn't mock. It just holds you while you let go. But what happens when that version finally cracks? When the image no longer stabilizes and your face begins to morph, not visually, but energetically, that's when the real you begins to bleed through the image. And what rises from underneath doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't even ask to be understood. It just steps forward, and everything that was pretending begins to fall away. There's a silence inside a mirror that feels different after someone you love dies. You glance at your reflection, and for a second, it feels like you're not alone, not haunted, not watched, just accompanied by something that isn't here, but isn't completely gone either. Some traditions call this grief. Others call it memory, but a few call it contact. Dr. Raymond Moody, author of Life After Life and pioneer in near-death studies, developed a method called the psychomantium, a small, enclosed room, low light, a mirror angled just right. The participant sits in silence, focused not on sight, but on presence. Over half of the people who entered that room reported contact, not imagined, not metaphorical. They saw loved ones, heard phrases, felt touches that left no mark. One man emerged trembling, saying she smiled like she did when I was a kid and then vanished. This isn't new. In pre-Columbian Mexico, Aztec priests used obsidian mirrors, known as Tezcatl, to speak with gods and the dead. But it wasn't seen as magic, it was duty. These mirrors weren't passive tools. They were thresholds. The obsidian, cold and dark, was believed to absorb time. And time, when bent in ritual, allowed messages to echo from the other side. The dead didn't return, but their voices did. In a video from the channel Afterlife Encounters, a woman recounts sitting in front of a black mirror in a dark room, attempting to connect with her grandmother. For 45 minutes, nothing. Then, the faint scent of lavender, the perfume her grandmother used daily. A whisper, not outside, inside. She says she ran, heart racing, not because she was afraid, but because she hadn't expected it to work. And still, the question remains, do these experiences come from memory or from something beyond it? Neuroscientists might say these visions are manifestations of grief, triggered by focused attention and low sensory input. But there's a difference between memory and message. A memory fades when unobserved. A message waits patiently to be received. And in the mirror, it's not just your face watching. It's your lineage. The most unsettling part? You begin to realize that the voice speaking from the other side isn't always someone you've lost. Sometimes, it's someone you used to be, or someone you were supposed to become. And when that reflection speaks, it doesn't use language. It uses recognition. So if the mirror does reveal the afterlife, what if it's not a place we go to, but a presence that lives in us still? And all it needs is a still surface and your willingness to listen. What if vision isn't about sight at all? What if the part of you that sees the most clearly doesn't need eyes? You stand before the mirror, eyes wide open, yet somehow it's your skin that starts to feel the shift first, then your breath, then something deeper, something wordless, like a message delivered without sound, in a language you didn't know you remembered. It's not your eyes that understand, it's your awareness. There's a strange condition in neuroscience known as blind sight, where individuals with damage to the visual cortex insist they can't see, yet respond to visual stimuli with startling accuracy. Their conscious mind registers nothing, but their body reacts as if it knows. What if mirror rituals tap into the same blind layer of perception? What if it's not your gaze unlocking the mirror, but your presence, quiet, focused, unguarded? In The Speaking Tree, an Indian spiritual publication, there's a story of a blind mystic who used a polished bronze plate for his sadhana. Though he had no physical sight, he claimed to receive visions through the mirror of the inner eye. When asked how he knew what he saw was real, he simply said, "Because it changed me." For him, the mirror wasn't for the body. It was for the subtle self, the one that lives between breath and thought. Philosopher Plotinus once wrote, "Withdraw into yourself and look. And if you do not yet find yourself beautiful, act as the creator of a statue would. Cut away all that is excessive, straighten the crooked, and illuminate the dark." He wasn't talking about the physical mirror. He was talking about the act of seeing as transformation. Not to admire, but to remember. Not to identify, but to sculpt what's already inside. When you look into the mirror long enough without expectation, without performing for the image, the noise begins to fade. And something subtle begins to speak. Not with words, not even with emotion, just a presence, a pulse, a pull. You feel yourself being witnessed not by a face, but by a field of awareness that's always been there, just outside the frame. This is where the rules begin to bend. Some people report the sensation that the mirror is breathing with them. Others feel a hum in the back of their head, or a tingling in their palms. Stillness grows heavy. You're not just looking at yourself anymore. You're in communion with something formless, ancient, and endlessly patient. And maybe that's the secret of seeing without eyes, that the reflection doesn't begin in the glass. It begins in the silence between your thoughts. And the moment you stop trying to see, something else sees you. The mirror doesn't forgive impatience. It doesn't respond to curiosity without commitment. That's why so many who attempt the practice walk away saying nothing happened. Not because the mirror failed, but because they never crossed the threshold. They stayed on the surface, chasing signs, waiting for visions, hoping for magic. And without knowing it, they fell into the first trap, seeking answers too soon. Manly P. Hall once said, "The occult sciences are not for the impatient, for the hasty touch the shadows and call it the truth." The mirror isn't triggered by urgency. It's triggered by surrender. When you approach it demanding answers, it reflects your demand. You see effort. You see your need. But you don't see what's beneath it. True mirror work begins when you're willing to sit with no response at all. The second trap is harder to detect, facing what some mystics call the ego avatar. It's not the real you. It's the performance. The you that knows exactly how to appear spiritual, composed, enlightened. One YouTuber on the channel Beyond Third Eye described how after days of mirror gazing, his reflection began to smirk. He wasn't, but his face, his own face, seemed to mock him. That was the moment he realized he was meeting the part of himself that knew how to manipulate even him. And then there's the final trap, the emotional flood without integration. When the mirror finally does open, it doesn't always show peace. It shows the repressed, the unprocessed. Dr. Nicole Lepra, known as the holistic psychologist, warns that deep emotional excavation must be met with tools for grounding. Otherwise, we drown in the very truth we sought to uncover. Without journaling, breathing, or anchoring, the mirror becomes not a healer, but a magnifier. These traps aren't flaws in the technique. They're gates, filters. Only those willing to move beyond expectation, performance, and emotional overwhelm ever truly begin to see. Not because they're special, but because they're ready. Ready to sit in silence, feel discomfort, and witness whatever rises without flinching. And still, there's a final layer no one talks about. What if the traps aren't there to test you? What if they're there to protect you from seeing too much, too soon? Because once you pass through them, the mirror stops being a ritual. It becomes something else entirely. There comes a moment when the mirror no longer feels like glass. It doesn't shine, it pulls. You're not looking at your reflection anymore. You're standing in front of a thin veil, one breath away from something vast and formless. And then the question arises, not from your mind, but from something deeper. If I keep going, will I come back the same? In ancient Egyptian mythology, Thoth was more than a god of wisdom. He was the keeper of cosmic balance, the scribe who recorded the weight of the soul. But in certain Hermetic traditions, there's a lesser-known teaching, that Thoth didn't just observe the soul. He left behind a tool that revealed it, a mirror, not symbolic, but energetic. A device meant to show you what lives beneath identity, if you're willing to let go of it. Modern neuroscience flirts with the idea that our reality is a controlled hallucination. Dr. Anil Seth, a British cognitive scientist, explains that what we call self is not fixed. It's a mental model created and updated moment by moment. When you confront your reflection deeply enough, you're not just seeing your image. You're confronting the fragile illusion of who you think you are. And that illusion, if questioned too directly, begins to collapse. On Quora, a man shared an account after years of silent mirror work. He wrote that one day, after whispering the words, "I'm ready," something changed. Not outside. Inside, his reflection didn't move, but it felt as if something else stepped forward through it. He described a quiet stillness that spread through his body, followed by a strange clarity. I wasn't afraid anymore, he said. Not of life, not of death, not even of myself. And that's where the danger begins, because what the mirror shows you, it cannot take back. Once you see the falseness of your persona, you can't wear it comfortably anymore. Once you feel the presence behind your thoughts, every conversation feels a little more hollow. You begin to move differently, speak differently, but most of all, you begin to see differently. As if the world is being reassembled in front of your eyes, one frame at a time. This is the final threshold, the edge between being who the world trained you to be and becoming what your soul remembers you were. The mirror doesn't force you to cross it. It simply invites, quietly, constantly. And if you choose to step forward, it doesn't promise clarity. It promises transformation, violent, gentle, irreversible. Because maybe the mirror of Thoth isn't just a reflection. Maybe it's a test, a question without words, asked in a silence so deep it echoes through lifetimes. And once you answer, there's no turning back.